Trump just announced that American oil companies will spend billions to fix Venezuela's badly broken oil infrastructure. And if you're wondering why the country with the world's largest proven oil reserves needs anyone to fix anything, you're asking exactly the right question. Venezuela has 303 billion barrels of oil. That's 17% of every drop of oil on planet Earth. More than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than Russia. They also have an estimated 10,000 metric tons of gold worth $1.4 trillion sitting underground in the Orinoco mining arc. So here's the question nobody's answering. How does a country sitting on more oil than anyone else on Earth and enough gold to make King Midas jealous end up so broke that foreign companies need to come in and rebuild everything from scratch? The answer reveals something most people never understand about wealth. Having resources and extracting wealth are two completely different games. My name is Alex. I've spent the past decade studying resource economics, sovereign debt crises, and why countries with unimaginable natural wealth somehow manage to stay poor. And Venezuela is the perfect case study in how to turn the geological lottery into an economic disaster. If you want to understand how markets really work, how infrastructure determines everything, and why trust matters more than treasure, hit that subscribe button. Because what happened in Venezuela is a masterclass in how not to manage an economy. Here's what we're going to uncover. Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia, but produces less than Iraq. They have 1.4 trillion in gold, but can't access their own 22.5 billion sitting in a bank vault in London. And they just lost their crown jewel American refinery for half of what it was worth because they couldn't pay creditors from decisions made 18 years ago. This isn't a story about socialism or politics. This is a story about infrastructure collapse, brain drain, capital flight, and what happens when you break every rule of basic economic trust. By the end of this, you'll understand why reserves mean absolutely nothing without the machinery to extract them, the expertise to process them, and the credibility to sell them. Let's start with the oil. Because that's where the myth and the reality split so dramatically you'd think we're talking about two different countries. Venezuela's Orinoco Belt holds 303 billion barrels of proven reserves. The U.S. Energy Information Administration confirmed this. It's not disputed. It's not theoretical. It's real oil, underground, measurable. 17% of all proven oil reserves on the entire planet are in Venezuela. Saudi Arabia, the country synonymous with oil wealth, has 297 billion barrels. Venezuela has more. But here's where it gets interesting. In the 1990s, Venezuela produced 3.5 million barrels per day. They were a legitimate oil power. Today, they pump less than 1 million barrels per day. That's under 1% of global production. Iraq produces more. The United Arab Emirates produces more. Libya, a country that went through a civil war and complete government collapse, produces more oil than Venezuela does right now. So what happened? How does the country with the most oil on Earth end up producing less than war-torn nations? The infrastructure collapsed. And I don't mean it declined. I don't mean it got outdated. I mean it catastrophically failed. PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, admitted that pipelines haven't been updated in 50 years. 50 years. Think about that. The oil infrastructure Venezuela is using today was built when Richard Nixon was president, when gas cost 36 cents a gallon, when the Beatles were still together. The cost to restore production to 1990s levels? $8 billion minimum. That's just to get back to 3 million barrels per day. If Venezuela wanted to reach peak capacity and actually use all that oil they're sitting on, $58 billion. That's not a repair bill, that's a rebuild, everything from scratch bill, and the breakdowns aren't theoretical. In 2012, the Amoy refinery exploded. 48 people lost their lives. It became the largest refinery disaster in 15 years. The explosion was so massive it registered on seismic monitors. The cause? Decades of deferred maintenance. Equipment that should have been replaced in the 1980s was still running in 2012. In 2020, the El Polito refinery leaked 20,000 barrels of crude oil into protected coastal waters. 20,000 barrels. That's not a spill, that's an environmental catastrophe. And it happened because the infrastructure was so degraded that basic containment failed. Then in 2021, a single pipeline explosion halted 85 wells simultaneously. 85. One failure cascaded through the entire system because everything is so old, so interconnected, and so fragile that a single point of failure can shut down production across multiple fields. This is what Trump meant when he said the infrastructure is badly broken. It's not broken like your car needs an oil change. It's broken like your car has been sitting in a field for 30 years, and now you need a new engine, new transmission, new everything. Now we get to the part that actually matters. Because aging infrastructure is one thing, but what Venezuela did next turned a fixable problem into a permanent disaster. In 2002 and 2003, PDVSA workers went on strike. It was a massive labor action involving thousands of employees protesting government policies. The government's response? Fire them. Not some of them, not the ringleaders. 18,000 employees. Nearly half the entire workforce of PDVSA was terminated in one move. These weren't just workers, these were petroleum engineers, geologists, refinery technicians, people with decades of specialized experience in extracting and processing Venezuela's extra heavy crude oil. You can't just replace that expertise. Oil extraction isn't a job you learn on YouTube. It takes years of training and hands-on experience. But Venezuela tried. They replaced those 18,000 skilled workers with political appointees, people who were loyal to the government but had no technical background in petroleum engineering. Imagine firing every experienced pilot at an airline and replacing them with people who've never flown a plane but really support the CEO. Venezuela never hit 3 million barrels per day again after that purge. Never. The production numbers dropped and kept dropping because the people who knew how to keep the ancient infrastructure running were gone, and the people who replaced them didn't have the knowledge to maintain, let alone improve, production. This is what I call the talent drain, and it's more destructive than any economic policy. You can print money. You can nationalize industries. You can change laws. But you cannot print petroleum engineers. Once that knowledge walks out the door, it takes decades to rebuild. But even without skilled workers and even with collapsing infrastructure, Venezuela could have attracted foreign investment to fix the problem. International oil companies have the capital, the expertise, and the equipment to restore production. Companies like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips had already invested billions in Venezuelan oil fields. Then in 2007, Venezuela expropriated their assets. Expropriation is a polite word for government seizure. Venezuela took control of foreign-owned projects in the Orinoco Belt without adequate compensation. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips lost billions in investments overnight, and that triggered a capital flight problem that Venezuela has never recovered from. Because international oil companies talk to each other. When one company gets their assets seized, every other company on Earth takes notes. Foreign direct investment into Venezuela's oil sector dropped to nearly zero. Nobody would commit capital to a country that had just demonstrated. It would seize your assets whenever it felt like it. Without foreign capital, infrastructure upgrades stopped completely. Venezuela's extra heavy crude oil requires specialized processing. It's not like the light, sweet crude that flows easily. Orinoco crude is thick, viscous, and requires advanced refining techniques. Venezuela had built that capability with foreign partners. When those partners left, the capability left with them. Here's the cruel irony. The Orinoco crude that makes up most of Venezuela's massive reserves is nearly impossible for Venezuela to process on its own. They have the oil. They just can't turn it into anything useful without the technology and expertise they drove away. Which brings us to the CITGO paradox. And this is where the story gets almost absurd. CITGO is a US-based refinery with 800,000 barrels per day capacity. It was owned by Venezuela through PDVSA, and it was purpose-built to process Venezuelan heavy crude. CITGO was Venezuela's crown jewel, their connection to the US crown jewel market, their refining lifeline. In November 2025, CITGO was sold at auction to Elliott's Amber Energy for $5.9 billion. Venezuela didn't want to sell it. They were forced to sell it by US courts to pay creditors. Those creditors? Companies like ConocoPhillips and Crystalex, who won judgments against Venezuela for those 2007 expropriations. The court valued CITGO at $13 billion. Venezuela claimed it was worth $18 billion. Creditors seeking $21 billion in total judgments won't even be fully paid from the sale. Venezuela lost their most valuable foreign asset for half of what they said it was worth, and they lost it because they couldn't honor contracts from 18 years ago. Think about what that means. Venezuela's decision in 2007 to seize foreign assets is still costing them in 2025. They lost their best refining capability because they didn't pay their bills from nearly 2 decades ago. That's not an economic policy failure. That's a trust destruction so complete it echoes across decades. Now let's talk about the gold. Because if the oil story is bad, the gold story is somehow even more frustrating. Venezuela holds 161 metric tons of gold in central bank vaults. At current prices, that's $22.5 billion. That makes Venezuela the largest gold holder in Latin America. They have more monetary gold reserves than Brazil, Mexico, or any other country in the region. Plus, the Orinoco mining arc contains an estimated 10,000 metric tons of untapped gold. That's $1.4 trillion worth at current market prices. 1.4 trillion. For context, that's more than the entire GDP of Australia. So Venezuela has 22.5 billion in gold in vaults and 1.4 trillion in gold in the ground. You'd think that would provide some economic cushion, but here's the problem. $1.8 billion of Venezuelan gold has been frozen at the Bank of England since 2018. It's been sitting in London for 7 years in a legal battle over government legitimacy. Venezuela wanted to repatriate that gold. The Bank of England said no. The British courts got involved. The dispute centered on who actually controls Venezuela's government. Is it Maduro? Is it the opposition? Who has legal authority to control the nation's gold reserves? While lawyers argued, the gold sat in a vault doing nothing. Maduro called it piracy of the 21st century. And regardless of your political views, he's not entirely incorrect. Venezuela's own gold, held in reserve, is inaccessible because of international legal disputes. Having 1.4 trillion in resources underground doesn't matter if you can't even access the 22.5 billion you already extracted. The mining arc gold faces a different problem. To extract it, you need massive capital investment, advanced mining equipment, environmental management systems, and international buyers. All of that requires foreign investment, and we're back to the same trust problem. Companies that invested in Venezuela's oil sector got expropriated. Companies that loaned money to Venezuela are still in court trying to get paid. Companies that bought Venezuelan bonds got restructured at pennies on the dollar. Nobody trusts Venezuela to honor contracts. The World Gold Council tracks this. Mining investment in Venezuela has been nearly non-existent for over a decade. That 1.4 trillion in gold might as well be on the moon for all the good it does the Venezuelan economy right now. If you've made it this far, you're already ahead of 90% of people who think natural resources automatically equal wealth. But don't stop now. Because what comes next is the part that explains why Venezuela's recovery is going to take way longer than anyone expects. The market trust problem is the real issue, and it's invisible but absolutely critical. ConocoPhillips spent 15 years in international courts winning judgments against Venezuela. Crystal spent over a decade fighting for compensation. ExxonMobil is still pursuing claims. These companies eventually won, and they collected by forcing the sale of Venezuelan assets like CITGO. That created a precedent. If you invest in Venezuela and they seize your assets, you will spend 15 years in court, you will eventually win a judgment, and you will collect by taking whatever Venezuelan assets you can find anywhere in the world. That's the new reality. But here's what that means for future investment. No major oil company will commit capital to Venezuela without ironclad legal protections. They want guarantees that their investments won't be seized. They want international arbitration clauses. They want the ability to take disputes outside Venezuelan courts. They want insurance mechanisms that let them recover capital even if the government changes its mind. Venezuela cannot provide those protections. Their legal system doesn't have the credibility. Their government doesn't have the track record. Their economy doesn't have the stability, so we're stuck in a trust deadlock. Venezuela needs foreign capital to rebuild. Foreign investors need guarantees Venezuela can't provide, and round we go. Bob McNally from Rapidan Energy Group warned that perception may race ahead of reality. People will assume Venezuela can add oil production faster than they actually can. Trump's announcement that American companies will invest billions sounds great, but McNally points out the obvious problem. Even with unlimited capital and full political access, rebuilding oil infrastructure takes years. We have historical precedent for this. Libya went through a regime change. Everyone assumed oil production would bounce back quickly. It didn't. Iraq had regime change with full American support and capital. Oil production took over a decade to stabilize. Political transitions don't produce quick oil supply increases. The infrastructure damage is too severe. The expertise gap is too wide. The systems are too complex. Meaningful production increases in Venezuela require 5 to 10 years minimum. That's with full access, unlimited capital, and perfect political stability. If any of those conditions aren't met, add more years. Venezuela needs to rebuild pipelines that haven't been updated in 50 years. They need to train a new generation of petroleum engineers to replace the 18,000 who were fired 23 years ago. They need to restore refineries that have been literally exploding from neglect. $8 billion gets them back to 3 million barrels per day. That's their 1990s production level. To actually use their massive reserves and produce at full capacity, 58 billion. And that's just the direct infrastructure cost. That doesn't include the cost of recruiting and training workers. That doesn't include the environmental remediation from decades of spills. That doesn't include the legal settlements still outstanding from past expropriations. Venezuela is the richest poor country on earth. And that's not a paradox. That's a lesson in what wealth actually means. Here's what most people get backward about natural resources. They think reserves equal wealth. They see 303 billion barrels of oil and 1.4 trillion in gold and assume that translates directly into economic prosperity. It doesn't. It never has. Wealth isn't what's underground. Wealth is what you can extract, process, transport, and sell. Venezuela has the geological reserves, but they don't have the infrastructure to extract it. They don't have the expertise to process it. They don't have the capital to maintain it. And they don't have the trust to sell it on favorable terms. Saudi Arabia has slightly less oil than Venezuela, but Saudi Arabia produces 10 million barrels per day. Venezuela produces less than 1 million. That's a 10-to-1 difference in actual economic output from roughly equivalent reserves. Why? Because Saudi Arabia invested in infrastructure. They retained technical expertise. They maintained relationships with international partners. They honored contracts. The real magic happens in the boring stuff. Pipelines that work, engineers who know what they're doing, legal systems that enforce contracts, trade relationships built on decades of reliability. That's what converts underground resources into actual wealth. Venezuela proves the opposite case. You can have infinite resources and generate zero wealth if you can't get it out of the ground, turn it into something sellable, and find buyers who trust you won't change the terms tomorrow. Reserves are potential. Production is reality. And the gap between potential and reality is measured in infrastructure, expertise, capital, and trust. Trump's announcement that American oil companies will invest billions is a bet on rebuilding all four of those elements. But make no mistake, this is a decade-long project minimum. The companies going into Venezuela now aren't expecting quick returns. They're positioning for long-term production increases that won't materialize until the 2030s. And they're demanding protections. You can bet every contract being negotiated right now includes international arbitration clauses, guaranteed recovery mechanisms, and legal structures that put assets beyond the reach of future Venezuelan governments who might decide to expropriate again. Those companies learned their lesson. The question is whether Venezuela learned theirs. The gold situation is almost identical. 1.4 trillion in the ground means nothing if you can't mine it, refine it, and sell it. And you can't do any of that without foreign investment, advanced technology, and international buyers. All of which require trust that Venezuela has spent 2 decades systematically destroying. The 1.8 billion frozen at the Bank of England is almost symbolic at this point. Venezuela has gold they can see, gold they extracted, gold that's sitting in a vault with their name on it, and they still can't access it because of international legal disputes. If they can't access gold they already have, how are they going to attract the investment needed to extract the gold they don't have yet? Now let me tie all of this together, because when you see how these pieces connect, everything changes. Venezuela's crisis isn't a resource crisis. It's a systems crisis. They have the inputs. They don't have the machinery that converts inputs into outputs. The oil is there. The infrastructure to extract it isn't. The gold is there. The capital to mine it isn't. The refining capability exists. It's in the United States, owned by someone else now, sold to pay debts from decisions made 18 years ago. The expertise exists. It left the country in 2003 and never came back. Every element of the value chain is broken, and you can't fix one element without fixing all of them. You can't rebuild infrastructure without expertise. You can't attract expertise without capital. You can't get capital without trust. And you can't build trust without honoring past obligations, which Venezuela can't afford to do because they're still paying for the consequences of breaking trust decades ago. This is the trap of resource wealth mismanagement. It's not a hole you dig in one year. It's a hole you dig over decades, and every year the hole gets deeper, and every year it takes more resources just to stop digging, let alone climb out. The political transition happening right now in January 2026 is a starting point, but it's only a starting point. The real work is rebuilding systems that were destroyed over 25 years. That doesn't happen in a single presidential term. That doesn't happen with one investment announcement. That happens through years of consistent policy, reliable legal frameworks, and patient capital that understands returns are a decade away. Venezuela is a case study in why geology doesn't determine destiny. Saudi Arabia and Venezuela have similar oil reserves. One is wealthy, one is broke. The difference isn't what's underground. The difference is what they built on top of it. Infrastructure, institutions, expertise, and trust. Those are the real resources. The oil and gold are just raw materials. Raw materials without systems to process them are economically worthless. You're watching a country learn that lesson the hardest way possible. They had 3.5 million barrels per day of production and threw it away. They had foreign investment and expelled it. They had technical expertise and fired it. They had international credibility and destroyed it. Now they're trying to rebuild all of it simultaneously while still paying the price for past mistakes. The investment lesson here is brutal but simple. Reserves mean nothing without infrastructure to extract, capital to maintain, expertise to operate, and market trust to sell. Venezuela has proven you can sit on the richest geology on Earth and create zero wealth if you can't get it out, process it, sell it, and be trusted to honor contracts tomorrow. Your future self, the one who understands how markets actually work, is counting on you to remember this. Trump's announcement sounds promising. American oil companies investing billions sounds like a solution, but pay attention to the timeline. Watch how long it actually takes production to increase. Notice the legal protections those companies demand before committing capital. Observe how many years pass before Venezuela reaches even 3 million barrels per day again, because that's the real story. Not what's underground, what can actually be produced, sold, and turned into economic value. That's the difference between potential and reality. And in Venezuela, the gap between those two things is measured in decades and hundreds of billions of dollars. What economic story do you want me to break down next? OPEC production cuts? The Federal Reserve's balance sheet? Why lithium deposits don't guarantee electric vehicle dominance? Drop it in the comments. That's what this channel is for. Explaining the market mechanics everyone assumes they understand, but almost nobody actually does. Venezuela had more oil than Saudi Arabia and 1.4 trillion in gold. And they're broke. Not because the resources weren't there, but because having them and extracting value from them are two completely different games. And Venezuela lost at the second game so badly, they're starting over from scratch. Remember that the next time someone tells you a country is rich because of what's under the ground, ask them what's on top of the ground. That's where wealth actually lives.